Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this last public seminar of the year in the Department of Education. Really delighted today to be welcoming Professor John McKendrick, and this seminar is being hosted by myself. I'm Ian Thompson, lead of the Pedagogy, Learning and Knowledge Research theme, but also by David Mills from the Centre for Global Higher Education. And John's talk, as you see, is the land of milk and honey, and I'm sure other things in Scotland. But John was appointed the Commissioner for Fair Access to Higher Education by the Scottish Government in January 2023. He's also a member of the Education Skills Reform Ministerial Group. And I mentioned those first because John's research is very much primarily considered to inform the work of practitioners and campaigners beyond the academy, particularly seeking to tackle poverty in Scotland. But what John described as his day job is Professor of Social Justice and Co-Director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit in the Glasgow School for Business and Society at Glasgow Caledonian University. That must be the longest title I've ever come across for any job description, John. But we're delighted John's going to be talking to us about Scotland in particular, but also the implications for the rest of the jurisdictions and the world. Thank you very much, John. John's going to talk for about 40 minutes, and we'll have time for questions.
Many thanks, Ian. Many thanks, everybody, for inviting me along. I'm delighted to be here just to share some experience then of the situation in Scotland, and as Ian says, to reflect on perhaps what that might mean for the rest of the UK. I'm going to start with some position where I view things. And first of all, I want to position myself in terms of higher education, a series of rhetorical questions. And should individuals who would benefit from higher education have the opportunity to partake? Should they, if they would benefit? Well, yes and no is how I view that. Yes, primarily, but no in the sense of, if somebody wants to come along to higher education and learn AI in order to rule the world, I'm slightly less comfortable with that. So I might have some moral objections. But generally speaking, I think, yes, it should be there for individuals who would benefit from it. Should lack of means prevent people from realising their potential through higher education? Absolutely never. And I think that's a real strong sense. As Ian said, I'm Professor of Social Justice at Caledonian University. I'm concerned then to tackle poverty and very concerned then that lack of means should be a barrier for anyone to realise their potential. Do we live in a world where there's equitable opportunity? No, we don't. I think probably involved in education, the people that are online would get it. We do not live in a world where there's equality of opportunity or equity in opportunity. And that's something that I think is wrong and something that we should have systems in place to deal with it. And maybe a more pertinent question, can we afford access to higher education for those that want it? And I think despite the prevailing tendencies in higher education to cut staff and to reduce posts and to question the value of a degree, I absolutely think, yes, it's a political choice that we make, whether we choose to make those opportunities available. So I think when we bundle those things together, then I would think, yes, very much so that fair access to higher education is something that we should be concerned with, and it's something that I'm concerned with. Some other position then, what about how to achieve it? My position is we should be achieving it. How do we go about achieving it? Should the collective or societal be a consideration? I talked about individuals in terms of individual benefits, but I think there's a mixed response here about whether the society and collective should be a consideration. Institutions are independent, and I think it's up to institutions and should be up to institutions about the type of institution that they are. I don't think that should be defined from on high, and it's not. However, I do think there is a societal dimension to the collective. If the state, for example, is investing much money in education, then it should have a stake in terms of what we get from that education. And quite clearly, in many ways, society benefits from that education. So we should be concerned with the collective and societal perspectives. It's not just about individuals. Is there a problem with institutions wanting best talent? Again, it's a mixed response, no and yes. I have no problem whatsoever with institutions wanting the very best talent, but collectively that might become an issue if it doesn't open up opportunity to all of talent. If we're only concerned with bringing in the best, then what happens about those that maybe don't seem to be the best? Is there a risk that they are forgotten behind? And I think collectively as a society that would be a problem if we don't focus on that. Is A-level in the context of south of the border a predictor of ability and potential? Well, of course it is to some extent. I mean, let's not pretend that it's not. You know, if somebody's got a good clutch of A-levels, it largely demonstrates their ability to sustain a programme of learning and to deliver what was asked of them. But of course, it's not as simple to say that A-level is the only predictor of ability and potential. And for many, they're not ready, or they don't have the broader context as such that they can't, at the time of asking, have their ability and potential demonstrated through their A-level results. But can we have an interview, for example, to overcome the limitations of evidence practice? If we're saying there's problems with the clutch of qualifications we have, can we somehow compensate that with other ways of determining potential? And again, it's a yes and no answer. Yes, it is if those that are interviewing are doing so with the perspective then that what we're doing in that interview is to allow those of talent that perhaps isn't evidence to have the opportunity to participate. No, if it's a case of those that are interviewing are looking for people like us that are a good fit with the institution. So we put these bundle of factors together in terms of position for a need for a fair access system. I think we do need a system that thinks about fair access, but it's not at all straightforward. There are a lot of complications in there about how we deliver that. So let me say a little bit about Scotland then and how Scotland views fair access to higher education. And I think it's very much the case that in Scotland, it's part of something bigger. Now, it's not presented in this way very often. I think it's a great undersell of the country that it doesn't present it in this way enough. But there are several 2030 visions that Scotland are working toward. Scotland legislated in 2017 to eradicate child poverty, which for those of you that are in touch with these issues was 1 year after the UK government reneged on a commitment to eradicate child poverty back in 2020. So Scotland has that legislative commitment. We are obliged as a country to work toward that. Roughly the same time, Scotland brought in a programme to narrow the poverty-related attainment gap in school education. So not just concerned to tackle child poverty, but to look at the inequities within school education and inequalities and to do work then to narrow that gap, particularly focused on the difference according to socio-economic background. And then there's this target to achieve fair access to higher education. So I think it's really important that we understand then that this desire for us to have fair access to higher education in Scotland doesn't stand alone. It's part of something else. And I think if we want to understand the prospects for achieving that anywhere else, we've got to understand that in Scotland it's part of something else, part of a bigger picture about the type of country that the nation is trying to focus. So what are these two other goals then that we might see as somehow contributing towards fair access? Has there, for example, been progress in tackling child poverty? Quick answer is no, not dramatic progress and not enough. Still almost 250,000 children in Scotland living in poverty, despite the fact that those children, the majority of them, are living in a household with an adult that has some degree of paid work. And it's too high a proportion. There has been some recent evidence that the numbers have begun to come down. We do expect in terms of projections that the numbers in proportion will fall down in the years ahead because of decisions that are made in terms of more progressive taxation, for example, but it still remains at a very high level and a much higher level than we would like if we're wanting to say that reducing child poverty will help us in the quest to achieve fair access to higher education. What about the narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap? So again, we might think if we want to achieve fair access to higher education, if we just think about pupils in school, are achieving more in school, then surely that will make a difference and help to the effort to achieve fair access. But the evidence isn't great here either. There are still quite significant gaps in the attainment between those from, for example, from the most and the least affluent backgrounds. Without going through the detail of the chart, the numbers or so on, we had a significant reduction in the COVID period because we assessed it differently. We took teachers' accounts of performance and ability into consideration in ways that we don't tend to do so. And when we returned to an examination or an examination plus coursework-based system, then the gaps were as large as they were beforehand. So these gaps haven't narrowed. Poverty hasn't been reduced significantly. So the kind of context that might have made a big difference, allowed, if you like, a step change in terms of access to higher education, have not been achieved. I mean, I've talked about these agendas as somehow being aligned to each other. There are ways in which they are directly aligned, and there's increasing acknowledgement in school, for example, that if children aren't fed adequately, then they aren't able to perform in school. And we're even seeing that in universities. My own university, for example, introduced a student pantry acknowledging the fact that not all students have access to enough food to enable them to partake of their studies and to thrive within that. So there is an alignment of these agendas in several ways and at several levels. Kind of the stuff that I do, I'm kind of wrapped up in these three agendas in different ways. And Enid mentioned some of the things that I'm responsible for. I'm involved in the Scottish Attainment Challenge and the group that oversees that. I'm involved in some of the work in terms of tackling poverty. And then, to my great delight, I was appointed to succeed Sir Peter Scott as the Commissioner for Fair Access a few years ago to take forward the work that Peter had started to try to increase the number of people in Scotland from a more disadvantaged background to avail themselves of higher education. So just in case people aren't familiar, it's slightly different north of the border, our education system, and it's not at all irrelevant to the debate. There are a few things about higher education in Scotland that are worth acknowledging. It's typically a 4-year honours degree, so where we do 3 in England, we do 4 in Scotland. There are 19 HEIs, higher education institutions. 18 of them are part of the core agenda for fair access, and it's a whole gamut of institutions, from your traditional universities, your Edinburghs, your red brick universities, your ancients, as we call them in Scotland, to your 1960s, as was then the new Robbins type university, through to your post 1992s and some small specialist institutions. So we have the whole gamut of institutions amongst that collective of 19. We have no tuition fee. Now, right away, we might think, well, there's the difference. There is no tuition fee. That's why we can have fair access to higher education, because there is no fee. The deal, if you like, with no tuition fee is that places are capped. So it doesn't feel like the marketplace that it is in England. There is a capped number of places that are given to institutions, and it's up to institutions to find those students and to allocate those places within degree programmes for the non-controlled subjects. There are also some places that are given to controlled subjects and above of this. But these two things mean a very different context to access to higher education in Scotland. Allocation of places to an institution that thereafter go and find the students, and no tuition fee for those that are taking part. Funds are dispersed by a funding council that's a tertiary focus. It deals with both colleges and universities. There is no office for students. There is no access and participation plans. And we have a minister whose new title incorporates the word tertiary education. Previously, that minister was described as higher and further education. Maybe there's more than symbolism in the fact that the title is tertiary going forward. And that minister operates under a Cabinet Secretary for Education. So the context is slightly different in Scotland in ways that are significant to the agenda. I'm not going to dwell on this a lot. The point being, poverty is found the length and breadth of Scotland. That's the point I want to make in this chart. It's just simply, and I have to say that there's a more recent chart that I could have shared. It demonstrates the fact that in each one of 32 local authorities in Scotland, the rates of child poverty are in excess of what the country is aspiring to achieve. It is more concentrated in some areas than others, and that's very relevant to the poverty agenda and the fair access agenda in Scotland. If I was to shorthand it, in West Central Scotland, there is far higher levels of poverty. There are far higher levels of the groups that are target populations for fair access to higher education. That's very significant to the agenda. So to some extent, a city bias, to an absolutely strong extent, a central belt bias, and to an even stronger extent, a West Central Scotland bias in terms of the depth of poverty that shapes the agenda. So what does it involve? When we talk about fair access in higher education in Scotland, what is it we're talking about? Well, we have a photograph that is long out of date. I used to have colour in my hair, and in fact, even those flats in the background are no longer there. They've been razed to the ground. But this is the brief that the Commissioner for Fair Access has, the brief that Sir Peter had and that I picked up. 3 bullet points, 3 big aspirations for the post: develop best practice, not individually, but in conjunction with the sector; improve the evidence base; and then primarily to hold to account those with a role in advancing fair access in higher education. It's collegiate. That's how I very much see it. It's very much a team effort. And while my job is to be that pain in the neck to those that disperse funds and make decisions, it's done in a sense of understanding how that broader systems work. Scotland is a small place. We don't like to admit it, but we are a small place, a population of just over 5 million, very tightly knit in terms of decision makers, third sector organisations and government officials. People tend to know each other. You get access to those that are involved in decision making in ways that are much more difficult in a larger country such as England. And I think it enables agendas such as this, it enables them to work in ways, as I say, they're not impossible, absolutely not impossible elsewhere in the country, but there's no excuse why it can't work in a scale of country such as Scotland. And this is the mission then, the mission that when we talk about fair access, we have a central metric that we're working toward. I'll read it out and I'll explain it a little. So by 2030, students from the 20% most deprived backgrounds should represent 20% of entrants to higher education. So we're talking total equity is what we're aiming for by 2030. So this agenda has been going for a number of years, but it's fast approaching its conclusion point, if you like, in 2030. You've got to unpack those statements and operationalise them in terms of working towards something. So for 20% most deprived backgrounds, what we are talking about are the 20% most deprived areas. There are some problems in that metric. Happy to discuss that at greater length. We are not talking about household and individual metrics here. We use an area-based metric to measure progress. And also when we talk about access to higher education, what we're actually talking about is first-time full degree entrants of Scottish domicile. So it's full-time degrees is all we're talking about in the access agenda, and it's primarily Scottish funded students that we're interested in as well. And in terms of the pedantics, 2030 means 5 more years. The data for 2030 will become available in 2031-32. So we've got 5 years to reach this goal, 5 years to make the progress. But the key things in terms of the mission is it's a very tightly defined goal that we're working toward. And sometimes I think that could be misunderstood in terms of the wider agenda and worth unpacking it, and I'll try to do so. Some other things that are significant in Scotland, we have widening access and retention funding. So there is a pot of money that's given to 8 institutions specifically for the purpose of widening access or retaining students. They are, if you look at that list of students, primarily the new universities that receive this funding. And the funding varies across institutions based on largely the number of students, widening access students that they serve. Quite significant sums of money, small in terms of the overall teaching grant, but nevertheless significant in the fund. Even the fact that signpost institutions are receiving money specifically for the purpose of widening access or retaining students. So there's money that comes with the agenda. There's also a community of access and participation practitioners. And I think this is really significant because to me, that's the engine room of fair access. I think it's really important that leaders make the right decisions and send out the right messages, and senior managers do things to facilitate the process. But the engine room of fair access is the interactions with those who are potentially the next generation of students. And I think the access and participation practitioners have been much underrated in the whole agenda. It's not just about decisions that are made by leaders, it's about the practices that happen there when we're interacting with potential candidates. I've helped them this year to do a survey of their members, because I think what was really important is that we hear from those that are involved in access what the realities are on the ground, both in terms of their work and experiences, but maybe the conditions and challenges that they face. Bearing in mind that one of my objectives then is to improve the evidence base, I felt it was important that we get better evidence from those that are involved in fair access about what the realities were at the current time. And the thinking behind the group is that this will be an annual survey, if you like, not something that's just a one-off, but something we could track change through time, longitudinal by design, and also in terms of every year, tracking where these changes are. We also have a national skills programme, and I think this is really significant. And the national skills programme is meant to be what it says in the label, a national programme about providing opportunity for the nation, delivered then in a non-partisan manner and comprising often a range of activities. 4 pillars, I say there, of intervention are part of that programme. Sometimes a visit to campus, top-up skills is a focus, information, early guidance and support, and specialist support in certain areas. And that's what it looks like in terms of different programmes. So it's a Scottish Higher Education programme, the SHEP, regional. It operates in 4 regions. These tend to be targeted in schools that have a lower throughput of students to university traditionally, a higher proportion of students then are in the target groups, and it tends to work with those students that might be in the cusp of perhaps entering university, provide them with that little bit of help that allows them to get over the line. It's targeted at what we would call the senior phase in education in Scotland. We also have a programme that's targeted at the high tariff professions, law, medicine, vet medicine, dentistry, and for some quirk, economics at St Andrews makes it onto the list as well. But interestingly then, these institutions, if we look at it, are your ancients. And it's recognised then that access to high tariff is as much part of the agenda as access to low tariff. So the agenda belongs to all 19 HEIs and is aiming to enter all discipline areas. It's not just targeted in maybe what are seen to be low value or easier to access institutions and programmes. Some specialist programmes for the creative industries as well. For example, the one with the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland's programme transitions to enable students to access the arts, which tradition has been viewed as something that's more difficult to access. So a bit of specialism, a bit of general provision, and targeting a broad range of institutions. And if we take that WARF fund sliding from earlier on and the funding from the National Schools Programme where it's targeted, we'll see that all of the HEIs are involved in this space of collectively working to facilitate access. And while some aspects of this programme might seem to be about recruitment, that's not the underlying philosophy and thinking behind the programme. The thinking behind the programme is about access. It's about widening access rather than recruitment to an institution. And that's a really important distinction to make. To me, if you like, the National Schools Programme, the WARF funding, maybe is an element of recruitment and retention involved in that. But the National Schools Programme is specifically about trying to get more people into university, wherever that happens to be right for them. It's not a recruitment exercise. And just an example there of what happens. This is Reach at the University of Glasgow for its high tariff professions in law, medicine, for example. S4, S5 and S6 are the school qualification years in Scotland, and different offers are made at different stages then. So trying not just a one-off intervention, but a series of interventions to support those in their access to higher education journey. This, I think, is quite important because it is one of the criticisms that sometimes fairly, but perhaps on the whole unfairly levelled at fair access in Scotland, is the obsession with SIAMD 20, living in one of Scotland's 20% most deprived areas. Now, it is the metric that we use to measure whether or not we're making progress. And so it's understandable then that activity will be focused on ensuring that we are making progress. You know, we are getting more of those entering our degrees from 20% most deprived areas. But eligibility is not restricted to that. So this is an example of the programmes then, the REACH programme, where the criterion to enter the programme is not just about 20% most deprived areas. And don't need to go through the list that's listed there, but a whole range of criteria of different population groups that in different ways are underrepresented in higher education. And the programme enables them, if you like, to compensate for the fact that maybe there are factors that make it more difficult for them to access it. So I think I always try to argue against the fact that the 20% most deprived is a fundamental flaw. I think there are absolutely problems with it. The key problem is the targeting. The reality of the way our societies are structured is that most people that live in a deprived area don't live in poverty, and most people in poverty don't live in a deprived area. So that right away tells us that you're just using 20%, you're going to have some really important misses. You're not targeting some people you should, and some really casual hits. People benefit from something they shouldn't. So it's not perfect, but on the whole, in terms of a strategy, then it gives us something to focus on. It's a broad indicator of progress. We shouldn't be using it as a very strict tool, although certainly an individual or household metric would be even better. But I think the key point is it doesn't only shape practice. And in fact, if you look at Aberdeen's website, University of Aberdeen, it's got about 14 different criteria that it uses in contextualised admissions. You know, to make it a little bit fairer, so there's a slightly less rigorous ask of those applying with a contextual admissions factor, which allows them to maybe drop a grade to be a candidate for a programme compared to those that don't have any disadvantage. And they have a big range of factors they take into account, not just living in a deprived area. So is it working? That's what it's about. I think as a programme, it's collective. It's a collective sense of purpose. It's not just about institutions gaining form themselves. There's a collective sense of responsibility in Scotland. We're working to different institutions play their bit in different ways. Is it working? Kinda is, kinda not. The bottom line is the number of students entrants to higher education from a deprived background, 20% most deprived areas, and the top line is the overall number of entrants to higher education. And if, you know, although it doesn't really show up particularly well, the bottom line, the numbers are bigger. You know, there are more entering higher education from 20% most deprived areas today than there were when this agenda started. I think it is fair to say that there are more students entering higher education full stop today compared when it started. And there's maybe something to look at in that sense. So that's that bottom line in a bit sharper focus. There was a step up quite significantly early in the programme when we began to look at minimum entry requirements. It had quite a significant impact in a short time. And then there's been slight progress, I think is the best way to describe it. Not transformative, but slight progress in terms of the numbers. You know, there's been a couple of years of dips. We're back up to an increasing number, but not quite at the level we yet want. But certainly higher than it was when the programme started, but not the transformative change that was aspired to. Although if we look at care experience entrants, there's been quite a significant increase there. It's almost a hidden part of the agenda. You know, it's mentioned as been a goal, but it's not something we tend to focus on as much. But there are certainly many more students with a care experience background entering higher education today than it was before this fair access agenda was formalised a few years ago. This is just a chart that to emphasise a geographical dimension to it. This is looking at the entrants in each one of the 18 HEIs. If we take full time, we leave out the Open University. The very blackest bar is the proportion of entrants from the 20% most deprived areas. Then we go from 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and 30 to 40. So, you know, progressively looking at they're all deprived areas that are on the deprived side of the spectrum. The 10% most deprived, then the 10 to 20, the 20 to 30, and 30 to 40. And what we see then is a number of things. There is differences by institution. So some institutions take in more students as a proportion of their overall student body from deprived areas than others. We'd expect that to be the case, and there's no great surprise then that the newer universities take in more of their student body from those from a deprived background. But there's also a geographical dimension to it that I hinted at later. If you look at the Glasgow area bars, those bars tend to be longer because there are more students, more potential candidates in their hinterland who live in deprived areas. So it's an agenda then that's particularly pertinent in West Central Scotland. And I think that's important if you go down to the second bottom group at the bars, sorry, the very top bar, we'll look at the northeast of Scotland most striking. Those bars seem very short. It looks then as if Aberdeen and Robert Gordon aren't contributing much to this agenda, because in terms of the proportion of their student body, a much smaller proportion than elsewhere in Scotland come from deprived areas. But that reflects the fact that on their doorstep there are fewer deprived areas. It's not necessarily that they are under recruiting. It's not necessarily that they are being selective in who they choose to enter. It's just simply the local students aren't from deprived backgrounds. And actually, they're doing an awful lot of good work, these institutions, to widen access. Really strong relations with the colleges, strong relations with the schools, but it looks as if somehow they're underperforming. So we've got to be careful with this metric. We've got to understand the realities of the nation if we want to make sense of the issues. There's a lot of text in this slide. I'm happy to share the slides hereafter, so I'm not expecting us to get through it, but I just wanted to emphasise the point. There's lots of good things happening in positive perspectives that we can take on these data. The 16.7% of entrants in the last year for which data were available matches the highest proportion ever in terms of those entering higher education for the most deprived areas. 5 institutions in the last year reported their highest ever proportion of students from the 20% most deprived areas. I mentioned that care experience continues to increase. There's been a slight recovery in retention that was dropping for a while, so more students from deprived backgrounds are being retained in higher education. And that if you took higher education as a collective issue, as opposed to entry to a higher education institution, because some higher education is delivered in colleges, if you took the proportion of those that are experiencing higher education in colleges and the proportion that are achieving higher education in universities or other higher education institutions, then it's about 19% of students who are experiencing higher education are entering higher education, are doing so from the 20% most deprived areas. So, you know, there's something about, you know, where we access higher education is important too. So lots of positives we can take in terms of the data, but for balance, there are also some challenges that are there. Retention rates are not good and have been lower actually in more recent, although there has been that uptick in the last year, they have been lower for a few years now, significantly compared to earlier years. We've not quite met the interim target. And even if every institution was to have achieved in the last year the very best it ever done in terms of entering students from deprived backgrounds, we still wouldn't have enough students entering to meet the target. Now, I mentioned that 5 had the best ever, which tells us that others have not. But if we took the best ever proportions and added them all up, we still would be short of the target. So there's still quite a bit of work to do if we want to get ourselves on track. Quite significant variation across disciplines. For some reason, geography, earth and environmental sciences is not a discipline that seems to attract students from the 20% most deprived areas. I'll say a little bit more about disciplines in a minute. And articulation, that shift from further education into higher education has been reducing for a few years. So some problems that are evident in the data, as well as some strengths to acknowledge as well. And again, I won't go through the detail here, but sometimes we can get hung up in numbers and we can forget processes and you know, philosophy and values that underpin what we're about. And there's lots of progress that's been made in the background that's not reflected in numbers. And I'm not going to go through all of these. One thing that I've introduced, again, to, you know, Sir Peter was clear this was something that had to be looked at before me, is we've got a change in the target for individual institutions. Previously, institutions were tasked then with having at least 10% of their students from one of Scotland's 20% most deprived areas. Now, you don't need to be a statistician to work out that 10% doesn't get you anywhere near 20% as an overall target. So in a way, it wasn't necessarily the best target to set in the first place. But it was also a real problem in terms of geography. Because as I mentioned in an earlier slide, by existing in the West Central Scotland, you're always going to meet 10%. And by existing in the North East of Scotland, you were never going to meet 10%. So the institutions have agreed to my recommendation that going forward, the target for an individual institution would be to match the best ever and then every year to try and improve upon that. So it's an incremental progress that we can hold institutions to account based on what's fair for them in their area rather than this flat target that worked for nobody. But that's just the kind of work that I'm involved in. There's lots of other things going on in the space, I think, that are laying good foundations going forward. Significantly, the support of the third sector. So the 2 main charitable bodies in Scotland, the Robertson Trust and the Carnegie Education Fund, are very much involved in this fair access space in terms of thinking about how they use their funds to support the agenda going forward. So it's not just something that belongs to HE. There is, you know, real significant contributions being made by the third sector as well. And lots of other things in this space, I think, that add up to progress, some of which are slightly beyond my agenda. Postgraduate education, for example, the Scottish Graduate School for Social Sciences has now a fair access criteria in terms of its decision making. Now, it's not to say that you have to be from a fair access ground to get access to a PhD, but it's recognising that's something that should be taken into account that wasn't beforehand. So there's a kind of culture, I think, seeping into thinking in Scotland, which I think is also a benefit of having that fair access focus. We begin to think in ways that we didn't originally envisage what fair access might mean, and we begin to change our thinking and our practices and processes to make it potentially more equitable. Just another chart to end you, but I've talked about fair access on the whole, as if it's somehow is a single beast and it means the same thing in same places. This chart there takes, and I do apologise for some of the small print there, but basically the point is made that if we look at those that are from Scotland's 20% most deprived areas and look at the demographic by age, then we find out they're very different populations. So in your ancient universities, your St Andrews, your Edinburghs, your Aberdeens, your Glasgows, most of those from the 20% deprived areas are young entrants. They're under 21. The vast majority of their deprived students are young students, school leavers basically entering university. If you look at institutions such as West of Scotland, Abertay, Caledonian, the minority of their 20% most deprived areas are young school entrants. Most of their deprived entrants are coming either from a college route or are coming later in life. The minority are coming straight from school. So the point being then that fair access means very different things in different places. And it might also mean very different challenges in different places when it comes to retention too. So we absolutely are not talking about the same thing. And I'm comfortable and relaxed with that. You know, if that's fit for purpose for the type of institution you are, that's okay. Providing that as a collective, as a whole, you're meeting the needs of the nation, you're meeting the needs of the population. It's fine for institutions to pursue different goals. The fair access agenda isn't one that's looking for uniformity, and in my opinion, absolutely shouldn't be. Just focus on one of the high tariff professions as well, medicine and dentistry. This is the similar graph that I had beforehand, and the proportion of your entrants that are according to different areas of deprivation. The black bar on the left-hand side is the proportion of entrants in that discipline from the Scotland's 20% most deprived areas, and the white bar on the far side is the proportion of your entrants from the 20% least deprived areas in Scotland, with gradations in between. And what we see then is that some disciplines are much more likely to attract those from deprived areas than others. I'd mentioned geography being at the bottom. This is 1 year out of date. Vet sciences has overtaken geography, I think, in the list that's there. But to me, the significant ones in that list are law and medicine and dentistry. Now, these are high tariff professions that are understood to be highly competitive to access, and traditionally were seen as being those for the students with the very highest academic ability. But you'll see in terms of the league table, they're fairly high up. Law in particular, in terms of its number of entrants, in ways that are surprising, slightly more entrants to law being from Scotland's 20% most deprived areas compared to education, for example, which is something that might surprise us. A first degree full-time entrants, higher proportion of deprived areas entering law. And medicine and dentistry, not been the very bottom of the league table, if you like, despite being a high tariff degree to enter. And there have been these changing profiles through time, using the Steinheimer graphs then from the earliest time at the bottom to the recent time at the top. Not wholly transformative, but you see the black bar is increasing through time. The proportion of those entering medicine and dentistry from Scotland's 20% most deprived areas has increased over the time of this agenda. Again, not transformative in the whole. There is still some degree of selectivity in who gets to access it, but I think ways are quite significant. More access has been facilitated to these professional fields than was the case when this agenda started. And if comparing medicine and dentistry on the left-hand side to the whole population on the right, what we find is the shift has been greater for medicine and dentistry than it has for the whole population. So maybe quite a lot to take in terms of numbers, but to my eye anyway, the graph on the right-hand side doesn't look as much as a change compared to the graph on the left-hand side. There has been a much more significant increase in the length of the black bar from the 20% most deprived areas for medicine and dentistry compared to that for the country as a whole. So what's needed? I say a lot of good progress, but there are still things to do. So what is needed then? Well, I think in some cases we've got to think education system. I've mentioned that the 2030 agendas don't just belong to discrete sectors, but they're part of something bigger. And I think we have to think bigger if we really want to make difference to fair access. We need, if you like, a whole system approach to educational equity. It's not just about higher education doing things differently. That's an essential prerequisite, but it's insufficient if we want to achieve fair access. The system has to work differently. And sometimes our higher education system creates pressures for other parts of the education system. It's kind of my belief, for example, that our preoccupation with grades as the entry point to higher education, which serves us fairly well in terms of being efficient, creates pressures on that school system. If we're asking for grades to get into higher education, schools have to deliver grades for their pupils. So it creates pressures on the latter years of schools being, one of the large functions of them is just getting the grades to go on to the next step at university. So the focus, if you like, becomes in the quality of the clutch of qualifications you can get. And I think we're creating pressures. If we think about it, the ask that we have of students doesn't need to be as high as it is. It's higher than it need be, and that creates pressures in the school system, and I think ways that are very unproductive. We also create pressures for the school system when we give an unconditional offer. An unconditional offer very often leads to a student disengaging from their studies. Now, you can understand why the student might choose to do that. It might make sense to them. They've got from the school system that they wanted. Why do they have to see it through? But it's an inefficient use of resource in that school system. The way in which our system operates creates a problem for them. And I think the way in which schools operate largely as factories to get, and it's a little bit unfair what I'm saying there, but largely as factories to get grades, creates problems for us in higher education where we have to learn them to learn in the early stages. So in lots of ways, I think we have to have an education focus of equity that goes across systems rather than just focus what we have to do within. I think also what we should be looking is a different philosophy for our learning, with less focus on outcomes and more about processes. Let's think about creating the conditions that allow people to thrive and to get what they want from a system, what we might call a relational capability approach to learning well. We're far too much focused on outcomes rather than really shifting our focus on to creating the conditions in which people can thrive, which I don't think is idealistic. I think there are ways in which that need not be inconsistent with what the goals are at the current time. I've got some fair access, some priority actions I've got as well. The interim target, I think we do need to focus on it. We can't be naive politically. It's important to the government that progress continues to be made. If we are bombing in this agenda, it's not good for them. and it might make them less likely to support it in the future. So even in self-interest, we've got to look at are we making progress in ways in which it was hoped that we would. There is an ongoing debate just now about a single student identifier so that we can track progress across the system. It's a battle to be won. The government are not fully behind it, but not completely against it. And there are 5 meetings going on this month with different interest groups to engage them and to canvass their thoughts on a single student identifier to better understand what it is the system needs. I think we need it. Sometimes we're shooting in the dark in terms of the investment that we're making. We don't actually know whether what we're doing in the longer term is having the difference that we think it does, because we don't track through time. And I don't think it's just me as a researcher saying that. I'm hearing that from educationalists as well. They want better system and better tracking through time. While I've defended 20% most deprived as a pragmatic tool, we need a better tool. We need an individual or household measure. Probably the best indicator will be free school meals. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we have. It's also transparent to those in education, free school meals, given that it is in that domain, that it's as a benefit that it's led. I think that would allow us to be sharper in our targeting, sharper in our focus. As I say, I don't think that the area deprivation has done as poorly till now. I think it's served us well, but I think it's had its time. I think we need something better going forward if we are to be more efficient in the agenda. I also think we need a national framework for early intervention. The whole school support that we have, the National Schools Programme, is fantastic, but it's at conversion. We lose students at an earlier stage we do lose students at an earlier stage, and our focus is only in the later stage. Now, some institutions of their own volition are involved in the earlier space in systematic ways. The University of Strathclyde is a Young Strathclyder programme, but it works with 12 schools that have a lower proportion of throughput to university, engages them in the last 2 years of primary school, continues in the first 2 years of secondary school. That's just one example of some work in the earlier education years, but that's 12 schools. There are 2,000 primary schools in Scotland. I think we need a different way of thinking if we want to do that properly. It can't be down to 19 HEIs alone, or even the HEIs in conjunction with the further education colleges. Something else has to happen, and we need that national framework of early intervention. And the agenda has to be bigger. Just now we are focused on a very particular cohort, full-time first degree entrants. We don't even talk about part-time. And part-time to me is quite significant, and probably should be more significant in the higher education space. And again, if you're talking to me as somebody who's involved in teaching on a regular basis, and I see the significant proportion of my students that are juggling more than part-time work and full-time study, something's not right about the education system. And if you were future thinking about what you would want from an education system, it might be that part-time study, or a mix of part-time and full-time study, even for an individual over the course of the degree, is the right way to go ahead. And I think we need to grapple with that. We have to encourage part-time in different ways, facilitate more opportunities for part-time learning. And I think it should be part of the fair access agenda as well. Just now it sits oddly outside the agenda. Just some final thoughts then. So I completely believe in 2030, the 3 aspirations. I think they're worth fighting for, they're worth aiming for. I'm fully behind it, but I think we do need to recalibrate. 2030 is fast approaching. 5 years worth of political activity or activity in education. All of the agendas seem a little bit beyond reach. I think it's unlikely that we're going to meet all of these agendas, and I think all of them are something that should and must continue beyond 2030. So at some stage in the next few years, there has to be some recalibration of what that work will involve. I do sense a renewed energy in fair access, and I don't think it's naive optimism in my part of seeing what I want to see. I think there is, a belief that this is an agenda worth pursuing, and some energy being put into that, both politically and within the sector as well. Poverty has been described as the key mission of the First Minister. The First Minister has nailed his colours to the mast and saying this is the main focus of my work. So these 2 aspects of the 2030 agenda are absolutely central and would seem to be strengthened going forward. It's less clear about what direction we'll take about the poverty-related attainment gap in school. The decision will be made over the course of the next year in terms of what that programme might look like. But I would be very surprised if it's not part of the focus going forward, which is good news for us in higher education. So there is an opportunity to be grasped, I think, with a new administration in place, but a challenge that's, 7 out of 10 maybe the way to describe it. We're going to put numbers on it. A lot of good progress made already, some signs of evidence progress as well as good foundations put in place, but certainly more work to do if we want to properly achieve fair access to Scotland. I think I'll hand over the comments and questions at that.
Very much, John. Really interesting. And we've already got a few questions online, so I'll come to them, but I'll ask people in the room if they've got questions first. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, fascinating presentation. Thank you. I had 2 questions really, so I'm not sure, you may not want to answer that, but you said that you thought there was too much of a focus on outcomes. But from an English perspective, you look at things like the PISA scores, Scotland looks like rather weakly relative to England. So it seems, I'm trying to work out why you think there's too much focus on outcomes when it looks like Scotland's performing less well on outcomes with their curriculum for excellence. And then secondly, you didn't mention, although it was originally a target back in 2010s, mid-2010s, gender or sex at all, and actually the underperformance of boys, because really big gender gap in performance in Scotland between young boys and young girls. Yeah. And there was a specific target, I think, to try to equalise that on a course-by-course level in the mid-2010s. And you didn't mention that, and it seems to have left the agenda. So I just thought if you could.
Yeah, so I'll take that latter one first. I showed my ignorance. I'm not aware of that target. I think it's certainly worth something looking into, and there are groups in Scotland, in Queen Margaret University, there's a kind of boys impact hub that's looking at that issue about working class boys. I think even in different sides of the country, that challenge presents slightly differently. So I think that is a live issue, that people are alert to the fact that there are gender differences that are not your typical gender difference, where, you know, typical gender differences when patriarchy has worked to the favour of men relative to women. There's increasing recognition in higher education that there's a different dimension to the gender inequity, particularly when we infuse that with class. And as you say, working class boys don't seem to be partaking of higher education in any way, shape or form compared to their peers that are boys that are not working class, or indeed to girls from working class backgrounds. So not part of the formal agenda, absolutely something that's been looked at in terms of something that we should be aware of in terms of the different inequities there. So the first point again.
First of all, whether I think you implied there was too much focus on outcomes.
Yeah, you're right. My concern about the focus and outcomes is we begin to make really bad decisions when we focus on outcomes. That we become paralysed by that drive to get the outcome rather than thinking about what is a qualitative experience and the learning experience that undermines it. That, you know, the question times, the equivalent question time in Scotland in the last few weeks has brought that issue up a few times about the fact that we are underperforming if you look at international metrics, and that we need to think about how we need to change curriculum for excellence. That's our system in school, which is a more kind of holistic basis to foundations learnings, thinking about competencies and values, and move to something that enables us to improve our performance in mathematics and literacy. I've got a slight concern with that. Then what we do is we shift to an agenda that's very narrow rather than thinking of the broader purpose of education. And the broader purpose of education is to enable an individual to achieve their potential, in my mind. And I think thinking of these values is a really important aspect of that. So it's absolutely not that I'm not focused on outcomes, but I don't think what we can afford to do is go back to a very narrow focus on outcomes where it's a be-all and end-all of our education system.
David?
Brilliant, thank you, John. Building sort of, when I take all your points about the outcomes. So without wanting to retest the numbers, you point to the stalling of progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you hinted that somehow a deeper quality of understanding the individual journeys might understand what's going on. So any thoughts you have about why that's sort of given everything that's good about what's been happening? And I guess the other perspective, just from trying to understand it from a comparative perspective, is the proportion of the 3% deprived in Scotland is lower than England, isn't it? So why is that? Because counterintuitively,
sure,
it's free access.
Yeah, it's different ways of measuring it. It's a measurement issue when it's as simple as that when it comes to the deprived areas, because that did surprise me when I first looked at that, and it was explained to me just a different way of going about the measurement. The two different index and multiple deprivation schemes that lead to what seemed to be, you think you should be able to compare directly, but we can't on that. So the first point, David.
Was around, you're stalling and you're
yeah,
trying to understand better the journeys.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's been put to me, certainly with colleges, where retention in colleges and higher education is a particular problem. There are much lower rates of retention in colleges compared to higher education. And it's very often put in defence by the colleges. Well, actually, we really don't know that that is a problem, because it seems to us, when we're understanding what's happening to them, is they're leaving to a positive destination. And we think that actually they might be returning to education, higher education at a later stage, a couple of years further down the line. So it's really that we're in the dark a little bit. We're analysing data at the point in time that's presented, which is fine, but we don't actually know if that tells the full picture, because we can't track these journeys. But there are a lot of stats that aren't good. The retention data aren't good. It's telling us something's not quite right with retention. My take on that, I think some people's take on it is that we're maybe entering too many students who shouldn't be at university. And that's certainly an argument in England. It's been a popular argument. Too many folk going to university. I've seen the research report that was released last week, and a significant proportion of the public were saying that as well. My take on it is that higher education isn't responding to the contemporary challenges. It's not facing up to the realities of what students might need to enable them to thrive. So in particular, I think it's a really important point in terms of making sense of the data. That COVID generation that came in, it seems as if that's the poorer retention rates, that we let in more students during COVID, and we have a higher proportion of students that have not retained in studies. So it would be a reasonable interpretation for somebody to draw as we took in students who shouldn't be there because they weren't able to sustain it and they left. My argument is we didn't change the system in any way. We didn't reflect about what we need to do things differently, and therefore we can't draw the conclusion that the students shouldn't be there. We need to think about whether the system's right, and I don't think it is. I think we have to adapt in ways that are fit for the times, or even the way that we organise our degrees in many cases.
Okay. One more in the room. I'll just take one online, a few online. So Gavin asks, what potential might there be to widen access with guaranteed pathways from college programmes that enrol higher proportions of disadvantaged students?
So we have an array of ways in which colleges interact with universities. There are associated student schemes where there is a formal arrangement at the outset that the student will be in college, but they'll be supported by the university, and the transition is in place. Some higher education is delivered in the college, but is validated by the university. So the University of West of Scotland has just introduced a university school with its local college, New College Lanarkshire, 4 degree programmes. They pursue the HND, which is the equivalent of second year at university, so 2 years of that in college, but then they transfer it to degree programme, but they don't change place. They stay in the same place, and that degree is delivered to them in their institution. So there are different models in place just now. I think certainly the retention issue is worth looking at. There have been a lower proportion of students, what we call articulating, moving from colleges into university programmes. So we want to look at why that's happening. There's certainly a perception amongst colleges that universities have been taking entrants that traditionally would have been going to colleges. Universities have been taking them earlier, and that would explain why some of the problem is. So it's not a completely harmonious system. There is, some would argue, within the system there is maybe predatory behaviour, but trying to meet our numbers, which doesn't serve colleges well. That's certainly one argument. But I think on the whole, there are a number of ways in which colleges are working effectively with universities, and it's a shared endeavour, if you like, for the students' benefit.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of questions. First of all, what role, if any, do you think the absence of tuition fees in Scotland has in this agenda? And secondly, is there any debate about fair access for other groups of students, like from other home nations, for international students, etc.?
So the tuition fee, you would look at that and think, why is there not fair access to universities if you're not paying tuition? And it's not a step change. It is something that is not that different to England. Now, that could lead to the conclusion that, well, why are we worried about charging a tuition fee? Surely it would be more progressive. And some have argued, Lucy Blackburn, for example, has argued quite strongly that actually tuition fee is regressive rather than progressive, because with a fixed amount of money in the system, we are shifting money towards populations that don't necessarily need it. So there's an argument to be made there. I think the reality is that the tuition fee might take away one cost to higher education, but the immediate cost of living means that that's actually a more important issue for students in terms of the here and now. So just not having a tuition fee isn't truly transformative in terms of fair access, because you still have to exist as a student. And if you don't get if you don't get living costs right, then no matter what your tuition fee is, it's not going to have the impact that you would want. So I think that's the critical issue, is the fact that we don't have perhaps a grant system that would allow more of our students to exist in a way that doesn't require them to either choose difficult choices between heating and eating, or of course to take on more hours of paid work as well. So was there another question? Was there two? I'm terrible at remembering questions. My memory's
Sorry.
Yeah.
Emotions.
So there's not too much debate about it elsewhere in the UK, but should there be a fair, as in Scotland, it's not part of our discussion. Our discussion's focused on Scottish domicile because that's where the Scottish budget has to go, is funding Scottish students. There is discussions about fair access to a broader range of groups and 20% most deprived in Scotland. That absolutely is always a live agenda. Gender was just mentioned there, but in all manner of ways various discussions take place. And the question's been mooted about postgraduate education as well. As our postgraduate education, should we have a fair access dimension to that? Now, much of our fair access is international students coming over, and I think there's issues of equity there as well. Now, we all know then that we kind of rely on postgraduate income to support our system, and I think having a fair access equity perspective to that might be an interesting infusion, maybe a moral obligation that we should have as well. It's not just about taking the money off the students, but where are they coming from? What's the career prospects? What's the sell that we're making to them? So I think there's a whole bundle of issues to do with postgraduate education we could look at. It's a slightly different fair access agenda to the one that we have for Scottish domiciled undergraduate.
Thank you very much. You talked, I think, at the beginning about the minister now having the title tertiary education, and I'm wondering how much you think that might begin to shift what's expected of your role. And also, you've just mentioned about people who, are you just getting into university as people who would have done HE and FE? Are we in danger within the current agenda of taking people out of other tertiary pathways, which actually might be perfectly, good for the career they plan?
Absolutely, right time, right places. I think sometimes we've got this hierarchy that we have, university is better than colleges, and that university is better than this university, and it's really hard to shift. And I think it's hardwired into the system. We've got this hierarchy of better, and our understanding of better is not necessarily what's best for an individual. And the more we can chip away at that, the better. I'm not naive and unrealistic. And Oxford and Cambridge is always going to be the two institutions that are seen to be the very best, but we know that they won't be the right institutions for all students, even ones that are exceptional students for a whole variety of reasons. So I think we need to chip away at that there and make sure then that the advice that we're getting at careers level allows people to take the pathway that's right for them. Part of that is having opportunity, having a greater range of opportunity at an earlier stage and having the information at an earlier stage that allows us to make those better informed choices. There's not enough progress made in that. We have a national schools programme that's about access to higher education. To me, that's slightly flawed. It should be a national schools programme that provides access to tertiary opportunities, because I think there are fair access dimensions involved in that. And that brings me, I've remembered a second point for once. That reminds me to your second point about tertiary. The 20 recommendations I made in my first report, the only one that was knocked out of the park and disagreed with was my recommendation that the brief for the Fair Access Commissioner should be a tertiary perspective rather than a higher education perspective. The only one that was rejected, and one that was a surprise to many, because a lot of the noises that were made by the government was about we need a tertiary focus, and then we had some institutions that have a Scottish Funding Council with a tertiary brief. The explanation for that, I think, was interesting and probably fair. It was, don't agree with it, but I can understand where it came from. And that was basically, it would look bad. The optics are bad. We haven't achieved fair access to higher education. So if we were to broaden the brief to tertiary, then it might look as if somehow we were weakening our commitment to higher education. And the second side of that, if we actually look at who's entering tertiary further education just now, it's an over-representation of those from the most deprived backgrounds. So therefore, we've not got a fair access issue to consider. I think that's wrong. I think there are more people that could have that opportunity if it was availed to them. I think that what we have just now is still an under count, if not an under-representation of those from more deprived backgrounds. And I think the change of title is interesting. I hope it's not just a shortening of title for the minister to make it a little bit more palatable, unlike my own title, Ian. I think maybe it suggests then that they're more open to this perspective going forward. Now, Sir Peter had his post for, I think, 4 years. My 4 years will be up in January, so perhaps there will be a new commissioner for tertiary access in January. I don't know, that's entirely speculative, but I'd like to think that whether it is January or beyond, whenever my term comes to an end, I'd like to think then, as well as perhaps having a single student identifier, a household-based metric and this new individual target for institutions, I'd like to think it was a tertiary focus and not just a higher education focus. I think it's the right thing for the country. It's a more rounded perspective about opportunity than we have just now. I think it was understandable and right that we were sharply focused on what we wanted to do to tackle fair access in higher education because it was a particular problem. But I think it's a mature agenda now. I think we better understand we're talking about a tertiary system now, and I think it's right that brief should broaden.
Thank you.
I'll take a couple of questions online, and I've got a few more hands in there. So I'll do them separately. Sure. They're quite different. So the first one is from Edward asking, does advanced hires being discretionary have an impact when students get into higher education? It's clearly a marked difference to the situation of A-levels elsewhere in the UK.
So advanced hires is an interesting qualification. Some would defend it to the hilt, others would see it as an unnecessary qualification. The advanced hire then is equivalent of an A-level. In the Scottish system, the higher is a lower level than an A-level. Advanced hire is the same level as an A-level. Mathematics is an interesting area with advanced hire. So even if you're not, and I've heard this by the National Maths Advisor, even those that don't necessarily succeed in an advanced higher mathematics, the understanding is that very often the students benefit from that extra year of still engaging with mathematics if they're going to go in an academic discipline that's mathematics based, perhaps engineering or maths or statistics. So it's not so much the learning that's important, it's the fact that they remain engaged in that space before they take the transition to university. That's one very particular way in advanced higher, enables the student to sustain advanced learning in a field that they're moving on to. It's obviously a flavour of advanced learning, and if it's delivered in a way that feels different to higher, then it's that transition to the form of learning they're moving on to. But if it's just a case of higher bulk, then I don't think it's particularly helpful in terms of advancing somebody's career. My daughter, my youngest daughter just now is just starting her 6th year, so she hasn't had her higher results. They'll come later in the year, but she's doing a mix. She's doing new hires, she's doing higher sociology and higher politics, and she's doing advanced higher in art. So she's chosen one thing that she's good at and wants to take it to the next level, but she's broadened out the opportunities to learn other subjects at higher. So very often that's that mix that students use in their 6th year. It's not just a clutch of advanced hires. And again, there is that disciplinary perspective too.
And George asks, it's great to see the increase in numbers of care experienced students going to university. Do you have any sense of what has supported this increase? Perhaps the virtual school head teacher role.
Yeah, but that's a better answer than the one that I was going to give. You know, the virtual head teacher, so that we have processes in place then that enable care experienced students to be better supported. All institutions have HE institutions have a designated person or persons with responsibility for care experience. There's also pounds and pence, and I don't think we can shirk it. There is bursary money for care experienced students, which means they're better able to sustain their studies than otherwise might be the case. And some institutions go beyond that, and have some residence accommodation offers as well. So I think it's partly a combination of resources and partly a combination of system shift, both in schools. Virtual head teachers is an introduction in Scotland, as the name suggests, then, that allows students that find it difficult in a school setting to sustain studies and to do so with the support you would get in a normal school. And that's not the only support we get for care experience. As I say, the HE institutions themselves have this body of work and people with designated responsibility. So I think there's a combination of factors that have led to that change.
Thank you, Dan. Now some hands went up. So
I'm really interested in some of the politics that seems behind some of this, maybe, and correctly, which is fine. Obviously, the choice of the 20% most deprived areas metric is a really interesting thing. It's also striking this 20% for 20% deprived, which seems to imply that everybody should get their 20% share, but you would think the top quintile is going to keep its disproportionate share. So you probably put the squeeze on the second quintile, right? The second lowest quintile.
Yep.
So I'm just, if you might kind of share a little bit, because I think it's important to have a political mandate for these kinds of programs. So what's I suspect the bottom quintile, there's a politics behind that. I'd be interested to hear more about that. And then what are your thoughts on this squeeze? If you might actually squeeze the lower middle, then maybe that's a bad scenario.
And it's a really pertinent point. And that is the perception that's there, and that is the worry that's there then, that the fair access agenda is benefiting those that are the very most deprived at the expense of those that are slightly less deprived. The evidence doesn't demonstrate that to be the point until recently. In the last couple of years, then the proportion of those from that second group A second quintile has went down slightly, so it is now something to keep a watching brief on, but until recently it wasn't the case. Certainly in terms of numbers, it's not an issue because there have been more places available. So each one of the quintiles has increased the number of students, so it's not been an issue in terms of number. And until recently, it wasn't an issue in terms of proportion. The proportional fall was actually the very least deprived areas. But recently, I think it's something to keep an eye on. So that now is a live issue to watch, but hasn't been until recently. The politics behind it is really interesting. So I think generally Scotland has signed up to this idea of being a progressive nation. And what you've had in Scottish politics is a broad consensus. Across the political spectrum, every political party bought into the idea of, for example, eradicating child poverty. Now, that's significant. 2016, the UK government reneges in its commitment. The Conservative-led government reneges the commitment. In Scotland, 1 year later, Conservative politicians vote for this to be introduced. So there's a different mindset to the politics in Scotland. That might be different in this particular parliamentary term. We now have 17 reform councillors that might have a different tenor to debate that comes in. But until recently, we've had that political consensus. Interestingly, I had one Labour MSP contact me on behalf of a constituent that was concerned, the constituent was concerned that their children were victims of the fair access agenda because they had done what society had asked of them. They had now got themselves in a privileged position and they felt that their children would be victims of the fair access agenda because their kids wouldn't get places. And there was a particular issue in Edinburgh law a few years ago where all of the entrants to the law programme in Edinburgh had a fair access flag. They weren't all from the 20% most deprived areas, but all of them had a fair access flag. And that led to some kickback. Interestingly, a Labour MSP been one of the ones that, on behalf of a constituent that was railing against this issue. I think it was probably a little bit too, not that progressive's a good thing, but if you're too blunt in your instruments, it's a bad thing. It has to be something that's introduced in a way that's measured and people can buy into. But I think also it was an issue to do with the fact that's an incredibly popular degree. And every year there are students that are going to be disappointed at Edinburgh Law because there are not enough places available to those that want to enter that degree. And those that are able to shout loud will shout loud that they have been unfairly denied access to that programme. So there is an interest in politics. And the only other letter I've had in this particular issue, in addition to the Labour MSP, was from a Parent Teachers Council of a secondary school that in the league tables of exam results is always right up near the top. And not the head teacher, but the Parent Teacher Council were writing to me with a 6-page letter demonstrating that they firmly believed in fair access, but they felt it was a little bit unfair to their kids because their kids were getting squeezed out. But I get that. I would do I'd do whatever I would need to do to enable my kids to get the opportunities that I want them to get and I think they deserve. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with acting on behalf of your kids. But there is that issue in the agenda that's why I think it has to be done in a way that this agenda isn't a threat to those that have had privilege and advantage in the past. It's done in a way then that collectively everybody can benefit from it to some degree. And what it isn't is a shift of Robin Peter to pay Paul, and it hasn't been that. There's been an increased number of places that's made it easier and more palatable to introduce this agenda. I think if we introduce tertiary perspectives in a way that's not further education for the working class, higher education for the middle class, if we don't introduce it in that way, and we have a real focus on right time, right place for the pupils, then I think we could still be progressing this agenda without it being a threat to those that have traditionally been privileged by it. But it is a watch this space, and it might be a bit different this parliamentary term.
Okay, so Lauren and then Trevor.
So what work has there been on students at different stages of their academic journey, experiences of fair access, and what recommendations or insights do they give to?
So engaging with the students.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the standard. They very much with a climate in Scotland of lived experience is important. It runs through all of the policies. There's national standards for community engagement. There's an expectation that if you follow UNCRC, which is incorporated into Scots law, anything that involves children should have children's voices within that. So in all manner of ways, children are engaged. Enough, probably not. There's probably ways in which it should be strengthened, but both in universities and schools have got a role to representative bodies such as NUS Scotland have got contributions to make in this space as well. So I wouldn't say there's anything particularly exceptional about how we engage pupil voice or student voice in Scotland, but it is something that's hardwired as being part of the system, and they shout loud as well.
Picking up on that really, It's fascinating. A lot of what you talked about is structural and statistical. But the lived experiences of those children in schools of the school curriculum and their love of learning or otherwise that might give them those aspirations. Have you found the curriculum for excellence has altered the dial in any way? Has it been influential or not?
So I don't know. It's a quick answer, Trevor. I'm not sure whether it's been transformative. On paper, it should, because it's broader competencies. You know, it's not about a very narrow vision of education, but it's a broader competency. I suppose one thing that I was slightly disappointed with in Scotland, that we had a review, the Hayward review, by Louise Hayward, led by Louise Hayward at Education in Glasgow, that reviewed what we wanted from the Scottish education system, and that was trying to bring in a broader perspective in the senior years. So, for example, the group work was something that we focused on. The idea of a young person having, you know, the chance to spread their wings a little bit beyond the narrow academic subjects, but still having that focus in narrow academics part of the mix. It doesn't seem to have, you know, set the heather on fire and everybody's behind the idea. So I think there's more that could be done to, you know, have that broader sense of what education's about in the ways that does fire up students and in ways that weren't there beforehand, or if you're only focused on exams. Maybe one way in which we can say that, you know, that Curriculum for Excellence has been more attuned to or better able to create environments where more thrive is, I think there is now not a proliferation, but there's a greater range of qualification options in the senior phases. So some of them are more vocational. You know, for example, some of the 6 years in school have the option of doing partly in school and partly in college. So the part is your school curriculum, but part's going to college and get a different experience. So that in a way is providing an experience that's more fit for purpose for that learner. So in that way, you might argue we're creating the conditions for learning which are more likely to enthuse more pupils in the power of learning because it's more relevant to them. But I wouldn't say that I've noticed a great step change in students who come to higher education as a result of through Curriculum for Excellence. I would love to say yes, but I don't think honestly that I can. Either way, I couldn't say yeah, no, yeah, nay.
Okay, then we'll take a final question.
Thank you for your presentation. It is really important and really thought-provoking. I am doing research on internationalization of higher education in Ukraine and higher education resilience during the wartime. And in the frame of this, I had my research stay at the University of Glasgow. Last year, I was doing interviews with Ukrainian students studying there at the University of Glasgow, and Ukraine is very grateful to the University of Glasgow for welcoming and supporting Ukrainian students during these difficult times. And it was there were Ukrainian students who take part in these Twins for Hope initiatives, and those who had refugee status, actually. So in the frame of this, I have a couple of questions to you, but maybe only one. What, from your perspective, from your point of view, what lessons from Scotland's experience could be relevant for countries like Ukraine, where universities are currently trying to maintain access and support students during the wartime and future recovery?
Yep. So I'm not sure about the particular war context, but just generally speaking, what lessons from Scotland are relevant for other countries in terms of promoting fair access? I think it's that sense of collective, that it's not just about an individual game, but there's something about you, the type of country that you're trying to create. It's a country then that's this idea of enabling opportunity and people to realise their potential. It's easy to say it, I think it's difficult to achieve it, but if you can say it and you can have policies and processes in place that allow that to be realised, then I think that's the best lesson to learn from Scotland, is that it will sustain. You know, an aspiration for a figure will come and will go, but if you believe in what you stand for and you see it as part of something bigger, and you can connect to the direction your country wants to move in. So in the context of Ukraine, if you see the future reconstruction of Ukraine is built on enabling more people to realise their potential, because collectively the country will benefit from that. And it's like the country are investing in its young people and adult returners in higher education because collectively others will benefit from it. I think that's the strongest argument to put forward, and that's the way in which it's promoted in Scotland. It is not the land of milk and honey, to go back to the title. There's lots for us to do, but I think there's a lot that we've got right, and we've got this sense of purpose right, and I think that having that sense of collective purpose would be the main lesson for Ukraine. I've had 2 students in my work placement module, which it turns out they were actually aunt and niece from Ukraine that did my work placement this year, the third year of a degree. I don't think enough universities are doing enough to facilitate the learning of Ukrainian students for the short time, hopefully, that they're in Scotland before they can maybe return to where they would like to be. But certainly it's been a joy working with that aunt and her niece over the course of the last year. Two of the very strongest students in my group came from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. That's a good point too. Thanks for those who joined online, and for those of us here, there's an opportunity to go and have a drink down in the cafe. So please would join us.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I enjoyed that. Good discussion as well.
That was good.
Yeah.